Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let me start this video with a little bit of personal history. I love Slayer. I've been a big listener of thrash metal, especially the classic stuff from the 80s for much of my life, but out of all the bands from that era, Slayer is easily my favorite. But my love for them and really the whole genre was a bit of a journey. I developed my taste in metal pretty much on my own growing up. Both my parents really didn't care for the genre and collectively only liked a very select handful of songs and bands, but never enough that either of them ever felt any desire to introduce me to it. That's why for the longest time, my taste for metal was shaped really by whatever was currently coming out and what I was finding online. But eventually, I started getting more curious about the more classic stuff that came before, and just about towards the end of middle school, beginning of high school, I was a lot more familiar with some of the more well-known legacy bands. It was also around that time that I made friends with a really cool teacher who got really excited when he learned I was listening to bands like Maiden and Metallica, because turns out he was a huge metalhead in the 80s. Which was hilarious because back then he looked like how the angry video game nerd looks right now. Seriously, this is not far off whatsoever. And because his class was literally study hall and we didn't have to be so serious about work, sometimes he would just show and play me a bunch of thrash metal bands on the computer. And do you want to take a guess who his favorite was?
Exodus.
Slayer. The first song my teacher ever played for me, literally my introduction to the band, was Angel of Death. And I won't forget, he had this big grin on his face when Tom Scream came in. But I'm not gonna lie, I didn't love it instantly. I can't entirely remember the reason, but I think I just found the song too rough or chaotic compared to everything else I was used to up to that point. I wrote Slayer off, but I did get more into the other big four bands, Megadeth and Anthrax, and they, along with Metallica, would gradually become staples in my daily playlists. But every now and then, I would just have this itch to listen to Angel of Death again. Even though it was also thrash, it was different enough from the other three bands that I would just play it to kind of liven things up. And of course, the more I listened to it, I eventually was just like, you know what, yeah, this song is awesome, give me more. I did some digging online, seeing what people said were the best songs and albums, and I decided to give Seasons in the Abyss a full listen.
Oh my god. I get it.
I fucking love this album. Have you ever had those times where the moment you hear a song, already you decided, okay, I love this? So many amazing songs off this record. War Ensemble, Skeletons of Society, Dead Skin Mask, the title track. I am not exaggerating. Seasons in the Abyss truly was that jumping off point for not just my love for Slayer, but also my love for the rest of the thrash genre as a whole. I started listening to their other albums as well as all the big records from bands outside of the big four, and it was around that same time that I was becoming more interested in just learning the history of bands that I liked. Amongst them, of course, was Slayer. And look, ever since I first started listening to metal, I always heard the stories of parents and religious groups screaming how listening to metal makes you some violent, Satan-worshipping drug addict or whatever. And from my time already spent lurking in chat rooms, I picked up that Slayer were one of the original poster children for all those comments. So before I really read anything about Slayer's history, I was kind of expecting to see something like an old TV clip where some whiny old bitch on a talk show starts screaming how Slayer made her son a gay Satanist or whatever. What I was not expecting were the actual controversies that they were caught up in. And if I'm being honest, when I was reading them, even though I've never sided with detractors like this, I could at least see where some of them were coming from. I say this purely objectively. There were times where this band were definitely pushing the line, which is why I decided that in today's video, we are going to cover those controversies and ponder if people were really raising a genuine concern or just being lame asses who didn't want anyone to enjoy something they didn't. And it does give me the chance to make a video on one of my all-time favorite bands, so, you know, has that little added bonus. One last thing before we get started, I do feel obligated to say we are going to be covering some genuinely dark subjects with this video. These topics will be coming up in the video. If any of them are too much for you, this is your warning. With that out of the way, let us begin. Since the very start of their career, Slayer has been able to successfully stand out from the rest of the emerging thrash scene by being a lot more menacing than their peers. Not just by making music that was objectively more extreme, but also by making dark and satanic themes and imagery key parts of their brand. Of course, this has resulted in the band receiving all sorts of backlash and criticism, with a lot of people quickly labeling them as Satanist, especially with the release of their sophomore album, Hell Awaits. However, it never really had an effect on the band or the upward trajectory that they were experiencing. That would all change through the release of their next album, the legendary Rain and Blood. Everyone who knows this record knows what I'm about to talk about. But for those who don't, there was a big reason why that first song that my teacher played for me, Angel of Death, was so notorious. Not only was the musicianship just f***ing awesome, the song's title and lyrics were direct references to Joseph Mengele, a high-ranking Nazi scientist who practiced human experiments while overseeing Auschwitz. When the song and album had come out, a lot of people quickly started labeling the band as Nazi sympathizers, or just being Nazis themselves. Even before it was actually released, the band took a big hit just for making the song. At the time of recording, Slayer were signed with Def Jam Records, with Columbia Records acting as a parent/distributor. When the album was brought to Columbia, executives demanded the complete removal of Angel of Death, or else they wouldn't release the album at all. The band and the album's producer, who was also one of the co-founders of Def Jam, refused, and so they approached Geffen Records to handle distribution. And although they did go through with it, it was clear that even Geffen was hesitant, as they did not list the album anywhere in the release schedule. Despite that, and the before-mentioned accusations from reviewers and community groups, the band has never once apologized for making this song. To basically all of them, their approach to the subject matter was more documentarian, brought on by a sheer fascination in the history of the war. To be more specific, guitarist Jeff Hanneman has been very open about being a big World War II nerd, and as a side hobby, he collected war memorabilia, like knives and medals. A habit that started when he was a kid after his veteran dad gave him the medals he picked up from the Nazi soldiers that he killed. That is insane. How does that play out? One day you're just chilling, watching TV, suddenly your dad comes downstairs, throws a bunch of medals right into your face, and as you're on the floor, he just stands over you like,
"See all these? Each one represents a man who tried to kill me, yet here I stand."
Joking aside, just around the time before recording Rain and Blood, Hanneman had gotten some books to add to his collection that detailed Mengele and the experiments that went on in the camp. And it just stuck with him enough to become a source of inspiration. Angel of Death is like a history lesson. I read a lot about the Third Reich and was absolutely fascinated by the extremity of it all. The way Hitler had been able to hypnotize a nation and do whatever he wanted, a situation where Mengele could evolve from being a doctor to being a butcher. I know why people misinterpret it. It's because they get this knee-jerk reaction to it when they read the lyrics. There's nothing I put in the lyrics that says necessarily he was a bad man, because to me, well, isn't that obvious? I shouldn't have to tell you that. Similar situations to Angel of Death would happen over the years as the group continued making music that not only covered dark moments in history, but usually from the point of view of the villain. Just like Angel of Death, their song SS3 is in regards to another notorious Nazi officer, this time the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. Dead Skin Mask, my favorite Slayer song, is told from the perspective of a serial killer, detailing how acting on his urges brings him immense pleasure and relief. A kid even starts talking over the final chorus, begging a Mr. Geen to let him go. And then the serial killer motif is also in their song 213. All these examples weren't as polarizing as Angel of Death was, but this last one was definitely closer to that. In 2006, Slayer's then newest album, The Christ Illusion, would become one of their most controversial albums released for a couple of reasons. One of them being the song Jihad, which recounted the events of 9/11 from the point of view of the hijacker. Unlike Angel of Death, which even for all the backlash that it got, it still had a lot of positive reception from metalheads and music critics when it was released. Not so much for Jihad. Critics were a lot more dismissive of the song. It also supposedly angered the families of some of the victims. And in 2007, there was even an incident where the band wanted to perform the song on Jimmy Kimmel, but the network told them that it would be heavily censored. This almost made them call off the whole performance, but they decided to just go on with it and perform Eyes of the Insane. The broadcast interestingly did also show the band playing Jihad afterwards during the credits, but only the instrumental opening ever aired. I'm gonna start my thoughts by saying I don't personally get fazed by violent or vulgar lyrics. A lot of the bands I was listening to before and after Slayer had pretty much that same approach to subject matter, so themes like murder, misanthropy, or the devil weren't exactly new territory for me. And it's worth pointing out that many of these artists went on to become some of the biggest acts, not just in metal, but in all of popular music, with fan bases in the tens of millions. If violent or disturbing lyrics actually turned people into bloodthirsty maniacs, we would have seen that on a much larger scale by now. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, what Slayer chooses to write about is disturbing. And for some people, it's probably too much. But from everything I've seen, their interest in that subject matter really never goes beyond morbid fascination. Which, the more I think about it, I'd actually argue is something a lot of people also share, even if some don't like to admit it. Think about it this way. I and a lot of other people watch true crime content, whether it be documentaries, drama series, podcasts, YouTube essays. They become insanely popular. These stories almost always revolve around real people who committed genuinely horrific acts, and even though we get disgusted and horrified by them and still demonize them, we all still keep coming back for more. Not because we support what they did, but just because there's something compelling about trying to understand what caused this evil to manifest in the first place. At least for me. Watching and learning about these stories doesn't automatically mean you're celebrating the crimes or emboldening the people who committed them. You're simply exploring a darker side of humanity, which has long served as a source of inspiration in art across popular films, TV, books, and especially music. And in fact, if we do want to keep the discussion entirely focused on music, it's worth pointing out that Slayer aren't the only artists to write about socially taboo subjects. And no, I'm not just talking about in metal. Throughout my life, I have seen a lot of songs become insanely popular. Constantly played by kids at school and on the radio, literally everyone would sing along. But when you actually analyze the lyrics of some of these songs, you come to find out they're just about as dark as anything Slayer's ever wrote. Don't get things twisted here. I'm not saying we need to ban these songs or no one can enjoy them because of their subject matter. What I'm saying is that society has proven time and time again that we can either completely overlook them because they're in a more digestible format, or acknowledge those dark themes but still appreciate the songs because we know it's just a song. And look, to be clear, I know there are times when an artist's real-life actions put their music in a completely different and far more uncomfortable context, but in all my years of watching and reading Slayer interviews, especially while researching for this video, I've not found anything any member of the band has said or done that suggests they genuinely hold Nazi or white supremacist beliefs. And you know what? This last point is pretty cheap, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to think or call a band white supremacist when half of the core lineup isn't even white. I ended the lyrics section talking about 9/11, but if I had a nickel for every Slayer 9/11 story, I'd have 2 nickels. Which I know isn't a lot, but it's weird that there are 2, right? This, to me, is genuinely one of the most mind-blowing coincidences in not just music, but in all of human existence. 2 things happened on 9/11, 2001. 1, 9/11.
Totally apple juice. Way to go, way to start.
And number 2 was that Slayer had just released a brand new album titled God Hates Us All.
Oh, no.
To further add to the irony, the title comes from the chorus of the song Disciple, which itself is a song questioning God's existence. More specifically, why does he continue to allow such horrible things to go on in the world, such as war, viruses, drug abuse, and of course, terrorism?
That's the kind of coincidence that made man invent God.
Before any nutjob starts screaming that the guys in Slayer used witchcraft to predict 9/11 or some stupid bullshit, this album actually wasn't even meant to be released on that day. If you look up the album right now, this is the cover you're more likely to see, but this is not the original. This is. Yeah, not the most family-friendly thing out there. Just like how the album's title comes from Disciple, this art is in reference to the lyric, "I keep the Bible in a pool of blood so that none of its lies will affect me," found on the track New Faith. The record company was worried that the original cover art would have been too graphic for retailers to display in stores, so they delayed the release to include this alternative slipcase to be a more consumer-friendly version of it. Unfortunately, while trying to avoid backlash for the album art, the label ended up inadvertently releasing an album with the worst possible title at the worst possible time. And this was just one example of another one of the longest running controversies with Slayer, their art. Since the very beginning of their career, Slayer's brand has heavily incorporated demons, hell, or mutilation. And again, it was not so much because they were genuinely involved with that kind of stuff, but more so just to stand out from other metal bands. Even when people were yelling how messed up it was to use them, the band just saw it as, well, you're talking about us, so it did its job. Just like with the lyrics, even though they've never apologized for their art, there have been moments where it did really come back to bite them. Can't say I'm too thrilled to bring it up again, but there was one specific instance that fueled the Nazi accusations. For pretty much all the 80s, Slayer's logo had consistently been the name behind this pentagram, and while it drew some criticism, it never had too much of an impact on the band. That changed with the release of 1990's Seasons in the Abyss, when the logo would be switched with this. Yeah, you know what? Can't say this wouldn't have people raise some eyebrows, especially with how defensive the band was with Angel of Death. However, this wasn't the idea of anyone in Slayer. This was actually the idea of the band's longtime producer, Rick Rubin. If you're at all familiar with music production, you very likely heard that name. He's one of the most highly regarded record producers in the entire music industry, having produced a lot of the most famous records of all time since he started in the 80s. While working with the band on Seasons in the Abyss, his third with the band up to that point, Rick had asked Jeff to bring his book of Nazi war medals. He picked out the eagle, and according to Tom Araya, it stuck. We used it on our stage banners too. Of course, everyone got the wrong impression. They didn't realize that the banners were actually huge upside-down crosses. They saw everything that they wanted to see, except for what it really was. Rubin helped come up with those ideas, and he's Jewish. People always complain, but we learned a long time ago to ignore that shit. I already talked about the situation with how God Hates Us All caused, again, probably one of the worst cases of timing I've ever seen. But even the following album, The Christ Illusion, got a lot of flack for its art. It depicts Christ himself in a not flattering manner, and this time more retailers complained that this was too sacrilege to display in stores. So just like God Hates Us All, an alternative slipcover was provided. I gotta be honest, I don't have anything good to say about this. Yeah, it's toned down and you can make the argument it erases anything to identify that this is Christ, but this looks like literally. If I see this from far away or in a video with horrible resolution and I can't make out that this is an overlay, the brown color scheme and this weird blot pattern going on, it seriously looks like someone took a dump on a CD case. Even then, this still wasn't enough to some people. The label behind the band's distribution in India, EMI, had recalled copies of the album after many religious groups complained, having their entire stock destroyed, and said that they had no plans on re-releasing the album at all. Like I said before, I don't personally get bothered by this kind of imagery. And while I'm not trying to invalidate anyone who does find gory or satanic visuals uncomfortable, I also don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with Slayer or other bands using it. This is very heavy, very extreme music that deals with dark subject matter. And in my opinion, the artwork accurately reflects that. Album art isn't always designed to just look cool. It's also meant to reinforce the themes of the music and give the listener an idea of what they're about to experience. Just for comparison, if you see a movie poster featuring some masked guy holding a knife, you immediately understand you're looking at a slasher film, and you decide if that's either your thing or not. Album art, in my opinion, operates the same way. Slayer is not hiding what they're offering. I think at a certain point, it's on the consumer to look at an album, take in what's being presented, and decide for themselves whether it's something that they want to engage with. Up to this point, I've been talking about the broader patterns and reoccurring controversies around Slayer, but this last story we're going to cover is not only a more singular instance, but also involves actual criminal activity. And while I gave that content warning in the beginning, I seriously do think I need to give another one right now. If you do not want to hear this story, you can skip to the time code listed here. In 1995, 15-year-old Elise Marie Paller was taken from her home by a group of teenage boys. After successfully kidnapping her, they brought her out to an altar they built in the woods where they proceeded to drug her, then stab her to death as a sacrifice to the devil. Even after she was already dead, all the members of the group would continue to beat and molest the body. In the wake of the tragedy, her parents, who also set up a foundation in her name, brought a lawsuit against Slayer, believing that their lyrics, and really death metal as a whole, directly inspired the teens to carry out these horrible acts. Let me preface my thoughts by first saying that what happened to that girl was absolutely horrific. The people who are responsible for that are monsters, and I hope that wherever they are rotting. And I have nothing but sympathy for Elise's parents. I can only imagine how painful of an experience it must have been learning that that was what happened to your kid. But what always frustrates me is that whenever incidents like this does happen, the first thing people conclude is, oh, this is because of violent music or video games or movies. I remember also learning that some people blame German metal band Rammstein for inspiring Columbine because one of the shooters happened to be a fan. And to be clear, I'm not saying that the media we consume can't or doesn't have any effect on us at all, but it feels like it's always treated as the main or only cause. But every time you actually look into the people responsible for these kinds of tragedies, it becomes pretty clear that there was far more going on than music choices. Severe mental illness, social isolation, instability at home, or just long-standing anger issues. I don't understand how people can still think that it just takes a single violent movie, song, or game to turn an otherwise normal person into a psychopath. The overwhelming majority of people who listen to Slayer, play games like GTA, or watch violent movies understand exactly what they're engaging with. They're capable of separating fiction from reality and enjoying this kind of media without confusing it for something that should be acted out in real life. In almost all of these cases, the people involved were already deeply troubled. People who, sad to say, would have likely acted out in some way regardless of whatever they happened to listen to. If the Swiftie I used to live with stabbed me to death after I complained that she was blasting Midnights through a speaker at 2 in the goddamn morning again, is the general conclusion going to be that Taylor Swift was to blame and we need to ban her music? As hilarious as that would be, I highly doubt that. After going through so much of Slayer's history, both when I first got into them and now while working on this video, I can say that while I don't agree with most of the criticism aimed at them, I do understand why they remain such a polarizing band for decades. Slayer has never been concerned with making people comfortable. They write the music they want to write, and they never pretended otherwise. What I think has allowed them to withstand that criticism is a level of self-awareness that often gets overlooked. They know their lyrics, imagery, and overall presentation are extreme. But that extremity never bleeds into who they are as people. It's not an ideology they personally live by, just a fascination into the disturbing and macabre serving as artistic inspiration. Bassist and vocalist Tom Araya is an openly practicing Catholic, yet he's always expressed never being bothered with the band covering these issues or having them impact his faith. Carrie's written some very far out shit. If it's a good song, I'm not one that's gonna go, this sucks because it's contrary to my beliefs. To me, it's more like, this is really good stuff, you're going to piss people off with this. I'm well-rounded. I have a really strong belief system, and these are just words, and they'll never interfere with what I believe and how I feel. This is admittedly just some armchair psychology, but from my impression of the guys in the band, they've always operated under the assumption that most people are capable of separating art from identity. And that's why even in the face of intense pressure, they never once softened their messaging or apologized for their songwriting. The fact that they've continued to grow their fan base and remain culturally relevant, not just within metal, but in the broader musical landscape, suggests that assumption wasn't entirely misplaced. Most people are able to make that separation and engage with the music for what it is, nothing more and nothing less. Slayer will always be known as one of the greatest and most influential metal bands of all time. And they will always be one of my favorites. While I was still in high school, they sadly had announced their farewell tour. And while I was bummed to hear that they were retiring, I am happy to say I did get to catch them on that tour. They probably had the most amazing supporting lineup I've ever experienced so far in my life. At that same show, I saw Anthrax, Testament, Lamb of God. Funny story, I didn't have a driver's license yet, so I had to convince my dad to drive and come with me, and props to him, he agreed to do it, but he did not have a good time. I mentioned it briefly at the start, but he does not care for metal, especially the extreme stuff like Slayer. And yeah, safe to say, he didn't really care for Lamb of God either. But this one part I always remember was that while we were there, we were looking at the merch table, and I saw this poster they had for that specific show. It's this dude cut open with spikes sticking out of his body. I thought it looked sick, and I asked my dad if I can get it, and I will never forget. He took a picture of it, texted it to my mom asking, can our son have this? And my mom responded like right away, hell no. Can't win them all, but he did buy me this Anthrax shirt so I can still have a memento. Dad, if you're watching this, thanks again for toughing out a 3-hour show for me. It meant a lot. I'm not as into thrash now as I was back in high school, but Slayer is always one of the first bands I go back to when I do feel in the mood for it. While I was in college, I worked as an assistant for the photographer who did the cover for the War at the Warfield DVD, and through that I also got to work with some of the other thrash legends like the guys from Anthrax. I just thought that was really cool, getting to actually interact with some of the musicians I looked up to and was just seeing live a few years ago. Putting my life story to the side, I believe that does wrap up today's video. As always, thank you so much if you made it this far. I'm not gonna lie, I was very nervous with my last video being the first I posted in 10 months, and honestly, the reception and support I've gotten from it has been very heartwarming. I hope you've enjoyed today's video just as much. If you did, please do me the honor of liking and sharing the video and subscribing to the channel. We talked about old rock stories, but if you ever want to hear me cover current stories in the metal space, then please check out my weekly podcast, The Podcast That Rocked. Episodes air live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The link will be in the description, as well as the link to my new Discord server, where you'll not only have the opportunity to chat with me and get updates on new videos, but also have the chance to contribute to and be featured right here on the channel. For example, before this video, I asked my members to give their personal rankings for the Big Four of Thrash, and I promised them that I would give them mine at the end of this video. So without further ado, my personal and therefore absolutely definitive ranking of the Big Four of Thrash. Anthrax, Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer. Hopefully everyone acts like adults and this won't stir up any controversy. The f